Good Friday morning to you. As we end our series on David, and here we are, October 1st, as we begin a new month, and I really have felt like we're in a new season, fall and everything that comes with it. I want to just finish out our time with David, focusing on two events that happen in his kingship. First, it's worth stating David is the greatest king of Israel. It is the reason he is part of the lineage of Jesus, the Messiah. There's a significant reason that God uses him in his brokenness because of his steadfast faithfulness. What I love when you read all the way through 2 Samuel into 1 Kings is you will see a man who is trying to faithfully follow God. Sometimes he does that better than other times. There are times when he flees the city because Absalom is on the verge of killing him and he retreats. There are times when he advances. There are times when he shows mercy, and there are times when he creates judgment. And in all of that, he seeks the Lord's wisdom. And when he realizes he's overstepped, as often is the case in our faith life, sometimes we don't realize the sin we are causing in the moment, only in our reflection. David constantly comes back to the Lord. And the Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. So as we finish out the narrative of David's story, and remember, David was made king at age 30. He served for 40 years, so he was an aged king when he finally rests in the soil, when he finally passes away. There are two moments that I think are really important for us to just highlight as we think about his kingship. The first one comes in 2 Samuel chapter 15. David is fleeing Jerusalem. This is what I was saying a minute ago. Sometimes he relents and sometimes he advances. He is fleeing Jerusalem because of this battle, this war, this evil that has come upon. And so he's following God's path forward, and that means to leave the exact place where he has established his reign. We read in chapter 15, verse 23, the whole country wept aloud as all the people passed by. The king crossed the Wadi Kidron, and all the people moved toward the wilderness. So there's this advance of retreating, but it's moving in a different direction than they expected to move. Here's what I want to highlight, though. There's a beautiful parallel that occurs in this chapter that may go unnoticed. It happens in chapter 15, verses 30. I want you to hear what it says in verse 30. But David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, with his head covered and walking barefoot. And all the people who were with him covered their heads and went up, weeping as they went. Now, this is all because of Absalom's anger against David. And Absalom had found favor with the people, even though that wasn't according to God's design. And so David retreated so that they could move in the direction until God was ready to act against Absalom. And David waited for God's direction in that. Brilliant, faithful responses that are contrary to our human behavior. But when David goes up to the Mount of Olives weeping, there's a parallel between David and Jesus. Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives weeping, saying, "If it not my will, but your will." David goes up to the Mount of Olives weeping for hopes that God will spare his life. Jesus gives his life. David asks to spare his life. In all of the greatness of David's kingship and in all of the amazing faithfulness that David had and exampled in his leadership, he was not equal to God. He was not even equal to God's own son. He was human. He was broken. He could only lead the Israelites. He could only lead God's people so far before his own human fallibility took over. That's kind of an interesting parallel there, because sometimes we exalt our human leaders. We exalt those who are in power. That happens at every level. There's somewhat of a joke about pastors. Your pastors wouldn't have such a hard fall if you didn't put them up on a pedestal. There's a reality to, in every relationship, we can exalt a person beyond their capacity. We do it with our kids, we do it with our spouses, we do it in relationships. And that's an unfair exaltation, because in the end of the day, they are human and they are broken, and they are not that of God. See, there's a distinction between our human relationships and our relationship with God, with the Almighty, with the one who creates and redeems. And so if you look to chapter 15 in 2 Samuel and look at verse 30, there's kind of that interesting parallel then. David said to the Lord, I pray, turn this counsel into foolishness. Spare my life. Withhold this evil from us. The second parallel comes at the end of 2 Samuel. David has not been faithful in God's sight. David allows his success to take over, and he forgets. He forgets for a moment of who is in charge, who is leading the charge. David does a census in chapter 24 of 2 Samuel. He does a census of the Israelites, and he counts the people. He does this to celebrate his success. But after he does this, he's stricken by heart. That's what it says in verse 10. He is stricken by heart. He knows he has done what is wrong in the sight of God. He hasn't trusted in God to say that you have enough. He has taken it into his own hands to think he has enough. He's been successful enough. And so David asks for mercy. Now the Lord says, I'm going to give you three options. I'm going to say, okay, you are either going to have famine for 3 years, or you're going to flee the country and be out as a nomad for 3 months, or you can have 3 days of pestilence. And David says, I can't choose. I can't choose my punishment. You choose my punishment. You are gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. David says to God at the end of 14, I'm in great distress. Let us fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but let me not fall to human hands. So David doesn't want to be responsible for choosing poorly. He's already done that. The punishment is, different than the crime, right? He doesn't want to make another choice that might be out of his own selfish ambition. He wants God to select. See, that's kind of a test of faithfulness. He turns back to the Lord. So the Lord gives him pestilence. There is a plague. 70,000 fall. But God relents. God relents, but asks a piece of obedience. He tells David to go to the threshing floor and buy it and sacrifice. Make an altar and sacrifice that. So he comes to Gad and he says, I want to buy your threshing floor. And Gad says, no, I'll just give it to you, king. You can have it. And David says, no. This is really important. At the end of 2 Samuel, in the 24th chapter, the 24th verse, read the end of it. It's fascinating. It says, but the king said to Araunah, no, but I will buy them from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing. David understands this relationship with God. He understands that God is not a God to be mocked or to be taken for granted. He will not give an offering back for all that God has given him. He will not give an offering back that costs him nothing. And so he pays 50 shekels of silver for the oxen. He builds an altar to the Lord and offers burnt offering and offerings of well-being. And the Lord answered his supplication for the land, and the plague was averted from Israel. God shows mercy. As we flip to 1 Kings, we will see the end of David's life, and it's somewhat inconsequential. But in this moment, this land, this threshing floor that David bought, that he paid a price for, will become the Temple Mount. This is the very place that Solomon will build the temple on. A temple David wanted to build. And God said, is it for you to tell me where I am housed? No, it's my design. It's my timing. Once again, David is reminding that God is sovereign, that God rules and directs all things. And so David simply follows in his successes and his failures. He follows God. And what he does in this last act before that we turn the page is that he creates a legacy where the Temple Mount will be established, where the temple will be built, and all of the history that comes after that. It is for this reason that David is the greatest king in the history of the Israelites. So how do we relate? Well, can we relate to a steadfast faithfulness that helps us to see our successes as God's successes, and also helps us to know that when we fail, and we will, God is there to meet us in our failure, to show us the same grace and mercy and abundance of steadfast love that he had for David? Can we relate to a king who is incredibly successful, who is the legacy and the lineage that leads up to the Messiah, but also was broken and fallible, that made mistakes and that didn't always understand what God was saying to him? My hope is that this is an easy one for us to relate to. We probably don't see ourselves as one of the greatest kings Israel ever had, but do we see ourselves as God using us to further his kingdom? Because that's the most important detail. It is because of David's faithfulness that God's kingdom moves forward and prepares the way for the Messiah yet to come. We are part of that story as well. We're part of a narrative that God is using us to bring about his kingdom in this world, a kingdom that will never end. I hope you have a great Friday. Can't wait to see you on Sunday.